Hi, my name is Tina Haskins and I work at Rutgers University in our Slocum Glider lab. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what a Slocum Glider is and how this AUV operates. Behind me you can see I've got some slides for reference. First, what is an AUV? It's an autonomous underwater vehicle. Our AUVs are battery powered and we are able to talk to them while they're at sea using satellite technology. As you can see, remotely controlled through satellites. Slocum gliders are really unique in the fact that the payload, which is this middle compartment, which we'll discuss more about, can have a whole bunch of different sensors put into these payloads, and so that you can meet different science objectives depending on what your goals might be. Here's a list of just a few. AUVs, or the Slocum gliders, come stock with a C2D so that you can collect your basic temperature, conductivity, and depth profile data. In addition, they can also be outfitted with different optics packages, or optics pucks if you will. And those sensors are able to collect things like backscatter, fluorescence, and things of that nature. You can also do other sensors like an optode, which can look at oxygen concentrations to tell if there's hypoxia zones along coastal areas or not. And as technology moves forward, you're actually starting to get people that'll take larger shipboard type sensors and start shrinking them down in payload size. So it's definitely an up-and-coming future technology. So here's a glider taken completely apart so that we can kind of look at the different components. If we start in the front, you have this nose cone, which is actually a wet section, and housed underneath of it is something called an altimeter. An altimeter is constantly pinging, looking for the bottom of the oceans, or the floor of the oceans, so that it can tell the glider where it is. Depending on where you are, that may or may not be possible. This nose cone is actually, as I said, a wet section as well, and what happens is the whole way of how these gliders operate is based on buoyancy and changing of ballast. So we start off with having them neutrally buoyant when we put them in the surface of the ocean, and then what will happen is the buoyancy pump is just a piston that'll pull back, allowing about a cup of seawater to enter into the nose section. This creates the glider's nose to get heavy and angles it down into a dive. When the glider senses the bottom, or when it's time for it to turn around, this buoyancy pump, the piston, will push forward, pushing that water out, again about a cup of seawater, and it'll cause the nose to lighten and come back up to the surface. Here we have the fore hull. It's helping protect all of the components that are in the fore of the glider. There's also something called a pitch battery, which wraps around this piston, and its purpose is not only to provide the glider with power, but it can slide back and forth a little bit to help control our dive and climb angle. Moving further back, we have the payload that I'd already discussed. Here is the CTD. It's mounted on the port side of the glider. This is an example of a flow-through CTD, where water is literally just continuously flowing through that cylinder as it dives and climbs. The newer gliders actually are installed with a pump CTD, so water actually enters the system and pumps through, and that's giving it better conductivity readings. On the bottom, or on the underside of the payload, as well as on the top, is where you can start to add different sensor packages. Anything from optics pucks, which would be installed in the bottom, to PAR sensors, or ADCPs, or things of that nature, which could be mounted on top. The science payload also has its own miniature version of what you see here, which is the brains of the glider. This is the glider computer. The one inside the payload, again, is smaller, and it's just in charge of maintaining and collecting all of the science data. Back here, if we look at the main control board, this has its own separate storage capacity for keeping track of all the different missions and files that you need to be able to control the glider. It's also where all the different cables plug in so that the glider operates as one whole unit and can control each of the different features the glider has. Underneath this control board actually goes a aft battery, or the sled battery, and that one doesn't move forward or backward, it just connects to the payload and sits there. You have this aft hull now, which will cover this whole section, keeping it safe and dry. As we move farther back, we have another wet section which is covered by this cowling, and underneath this wet section you can see this black outline shape. That's what we call the air bladder. And what happens is, when the glider is triggered to start rising to the surface and make a call to us to tell us where it is or to transmit data, this air bladder inflates, giving it some extra buoyancy to keep that tail out of the water. And that's really important because in this tail fin is where we have all of the antennas. And your signal can easily be blocked if the tail were to stay under or submerged by salt water, because salt water is going to block that transmission. So again, this air bladder just inflates to give you a little extra rise and keep that tail nice and clear. As I said, there's antennas in here. The different antennas are your iridium antenna, which is extremely important because that's pretty much how you rely on talking to your AUV throughout the entire mission. That iridium antenna is actually making just a really expensive cell phone call using the satellites, and it calls back to Rutgers and connects to a computer that we call dock server. Once it's connected to dock server, it'll start to talk to us and transfer all of its current files. So that we actually get real-time data every 3 to 4 hours or even more or less depending on what your objectives are. Then once it's done sending its files, it'll look and see if we have any files to send it, which will update its mission or tell it to go to a new location or new waypoint. And once it's done all that, it'll go about its business, hang up, and continue diving. We also have our GPS and Argos antennas. Both of those are also important. GPS works just like a GPS would in your car. It's providing the glider with its exact location so that it knows where it is in relation to where we're trying to tell it to go. Argos is our emergency positioning network. If something were to go critically wrong with the glider, for instance, maybe we run our batteries too low, or maybe the tail is hit and sinks, or not sinks, I'm sorry, maybe the tail is hit and slightly disturbed, or the iridium network is down and it can't connect to the satellite. Whenever an Argos satellite passes overhead, you'll actually get what's just like a little Argos ping out. And that's just one location. We can't talk to the glider through it, but we can see exactly where the glider is. And it doesn't happen very frequently, but every now and again we actually need to use that to find out where our glider has gone when we're missing calls. And lastly, we have FreeWave. Each AUV comes with its own little box called a FreeWave box, and this is our free way of talking to the glider. It doesn't cost us anything, and we can just hook that little box up to our computer and just have a conversation back and forth with the glider. And mostly this is used when we're in the lab, prepping it to go out for deployment or when it comes back, and just doing basic lab functions. And then lastly, it's hard to see on this, but part of this whole DigiFin setup is actually a little fin right here. And this fin is responsible for actually helping the glider maintain its course while it's at sea. It'll correct for currents that the glider feels by either swinging that tail to the port or to the starboard and keeping the glider on its proper heading. Next I have actually how gliders fly. We have this little video here. We have one main glider in, which actually hits bottom, which it's not supposed to do. And then shortly you'll be able to see a second glider come down, which actually does a really nice dive and then corrects and backs up into a climb. But this is the profile that gliders make. There's no propeller on gliders, so they can't go in a straight line. Rather, they do this sawtooth pattern. And each dive and climb is called a yaw. And so when piloting a glider, I can either have it go a certain amount of yaws, so complete 5 yaws, come to the surface and call me, or I could do it on a time basis and ask it to go down for 5 hours and then come back up when it's done. But as I said, it's a very simple process. The buoyancy pump just pulls back, allows water to enter the system, the glider begins to go down, then that water is pushed out, and the glider inflects and comes back up to the surface. And it continues doing these yaws until it's time for it to completely come to the surface to call in, or until we ask it to stop. And that is how Slocum gliders work in a nutshell.